Hello. I'm really honored to be here today. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction. I have to say I had a wonderful tour today of Little Rock, and I feel very at home here because I graduated from a very similar program at Georgetown. So thank you for having me. As Khalid was nice enough to tell you a little bit about my background, I worked with the Wall Street Journal's bureau in Beirut for a couple years, predominantly covering Syria, but obviously Lebanon too. I also am part of a nonprofit organization called Zakira, which teaches photography to marginalized communities. And our larger projects focused on children in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and Syrian refugee camps as well. And I actually brought in 2 books that we published of their photos that will probably make their way around the room eventually if you'd like to take a look at their photos. So I thought, the war in Syria, as we all know, has become, more and more a proxy war. Last week we saw in the headlines there was a big meeting in Vienna where it made the news that Iran was finally coming to the table to meet with the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia to find sort of a solution to the end of the war. And what struck me about that were 2 things, not so much the outcome of the talks, but the fact that the biggest aspect of the crisis that we're seeing right now that everybody's talking about is a migrant issue. And none of those 4 countries at the table have taken in any kind of serious number of refugees. And B, there were no Syrians at that table. So the other, which is, telling of, to some extent, how powerless most Syrians are in that very conflict. So I thought for my talk today, I would focus less on the geopolitics and maybe offer just a few anecdotes about my reporting with the Syrians because, one of my mentors had once told me that, a journalist is biased, but they're usually mostly biased for those who are oppressed, those who are experiencing injustice, because you see it at a different level. And I can say that although I wasn't reporting from Syria, I lived and breathed it every day. And it was the human stories that are the most interesting, and you often talk to the most powerless people in the world and then talk to decision makers whose decisions impact their fates forever. So I thought I would share a little bit of that with you. And I'm sprinkled in some observations as well. The numbers. There's over 250,000 have been killed in Syria. There are over 4 million refugees, millions more have been displaced even within the country. The crisis is staggering on so many levels. I live in Beirut, Lebanon. We have 1.2 million officially registered refugees. And that's in a country that prior to the war was home to 4 million people. So 1 in 5 people in Lebanon right now is a Syrian refugee. Which they say is the highest ratio ever in the history of the world, which would be the equivalent of the entire country of Mexico moving here to the United States. So you can imagine the kind of impact, and Lebanon certainly doesn't have the political stability and resources the United States does. So it's really a huge feat for the country to face. Also, in terms of the human toll, the war crimes that are occurring in Syria are one after the other after the other. Nobody even talks about rules of war, Geneva Conventions. They're so far gone. And using civilians and violence as a tactic has been used by many sides in the conflict. And I say many sides because there aren't 2 sides, there are many sides. A lot of analysts describe the government's approach as a scorched earth approach, which would be, devastate the towns, get the people out, because in the end, that they become somebody else's problem if they leave, and they're from another sect. It works out better for us. We all know ISIS tries to terrify all of us with the tactics they use and publicize it and, direct these sort of fantastic, spectacles for us to see and be horrified by. But this obviously has an effect on people. Now, because of the dangers of covering Syria, so few reporters can obviously go in, which makes covering this particular conflict very different than other conflicts. We're so heavily reliant on things like Skype, apps like Viber or WhatsApp where people can text message, but it's not over a regular phone line because they're so afraid because their phones are tapped. But also, as a journalist, I mean, having covered, events in Lebanon over the past several years, there's something to being in a place and bearing witness for others and, describing what we could describe as the color, the smell, the feeling of a place. How can you do that if you're not in Syria? How can I tell you with any kind of real confidence, this is exactly what occurred yesterday if I'm not there? So it takes a lot of creativity to meet people virtually, online, and you sort of create trust in that way. I've sort of, if you're like a Syrian activist in Aleppo and you get me on the phone over Skype, I'm a woman who speaks clear Lebanese Arabic, and I say I work for an American paper. There's definitely not anybody you should ever trust. I'm either the CIA or Hezbollah. It's like it doesn't work for me in any good way. But somehow, sometimes relationships have been built. One fighter, there was the first incident of a rebel war crime in Aleppo took place in August of 2012. And at that time, it was sort of easier to get to people on the ground. Telecommunications was better. There were sort of less hoops to jump through, even on the activist side of networks. And I was able to get a hold of a fighter on the ground, and that guy completely freaked out. Like, how am I calling him on his phone? And so, unbeknownst to me, he had his friend add me on Skype and ask me sort of all the same questions that the first guy asked me. Who was I? Who did I work for? And I, said this American newspaper called the Wall Street Journal, blah, blah, blah. But what was interesting about that is that fighter and I, the second guy, developed this rapport over the course of 2 years, which was, by all accounts, by my opinion, completely bizarre, but also very illuminating. Because, in a regular situation, this is somebody who was pretty conservative, and I don't think he would have necessarily been the type of guy to sit with me at a cafe to talk politics. But over the course of 2 years, he had been part of a militia that took over Aleppo, and which was not a particularly Islamist militia, but before that, he was a student at the University of Aleppo. He was studying Arabic literature. But then he became disillusioned because he felt that militia was very corrupt. And he wouldn't tell me, but I could tell eventually. One time he told me there's a huge bomb is going to take place tomorrow, and the bomb weighs 1 ton. And I mean, you can't just go with that kind of a story. But then the next day there was a huge bomb, and the Syrian official media reported it weighed 1 ton. And the perpetrators were Jabhat al-Nusra, JAN, the Al-Qaeda type group. So I knew where his leanings now were. And I was really happy not to be in the same city as he was. But one time he asked me to send him my photograph, which obviously I didn't do. I actually sent him Angelina Jolie's photograph. And funnily enough, he asked me, who is that? He knew she wasn't me, and he didn't know who she was. But then I said, send me your picture. And he sent me this picture of a clean-shaven boy in a suit sitting on a couch with like a rifle. Not a rifle, like a book. And he was, and I said, that's what you look like? That's you? Because here I have this idea of this Islamist fighter with Al-Qaeda. And he said, well, that was me before the war. And then this is me now. And he had a beard, he had the rifle. And he was wearing not even, traditional Syrian garb. He was, something that I think is more traditional in Pakistan or Afghanistan, as shirwal kameez. And he said, that's me now. And then over the years, he then became, he was obsessed with getting engaged, and then he got engaged and he broke up with a girl, and then he finally got married, and then now he's a teacher, but in an area governed by Jabhat al-Nusra at one of those schools. Why I tell you the story is not because his story is particularly, illuminating, but for me it was because it showed me that sometimes some of these extremists, it just so happened that they became that way not only because of injustice and oppression or of an ideology. They kind of became disillusioned with other things, with corruption, and they went toward power and strength. And in his case, he felt it was a means to protect his family. Like I said, I'm really glad I don't live in the same town as he was in, but that was one example of how, because of reporting via Skype, I was able to develop that kind of a relationship, which I don't think I could have developed in person. One of the most meaningful stories I've ever written, or been a part of writing, I was one of 3 authors, was a reconstruction of the night of the chemical attack which occurred in August of 2013, but we had written a story in November. Obviously, no journalists were there. Over 1,000 people were killed. It was, by all accounts, a bloodless death. I mean, I spoke to a doctor who was telling me, he had a field hospital, which was sort of like would be a room like this, or like a wedding hall, which now there's a doctor in it and a few gurneys, and that's a field hospital. And he said 300 people stormed in. And they were dying. The first 7-year-old girl, that she just died, and he couldn't understand. There was no blood. Like, what killed her? And then as people started coming in, he understood. So we were trying to hunt down survivors. I mean, our correspondent in Washington had great intel and information from the intelligence community and the Hill. My other colleague, Noor, was literally hopping from Paris to London to like random towns in Europe, finding medics. And so I was in Beirut, and they said, you have to try to find a survivor because we can't. And the area that was hit was called Ghouta, and it's outside of Damascus, and it's this enclave of several towns. And it was under siege. So here we are trying to Skype with people there, and they were so afraid that they wouldn't even talk on Skype. And they kept telling me, like, this is old news. We're literally starving. We are under siege. You're telling me about a chemical attack? They died. It's over. What are you still talking about this over? And it was, obviously that is so sad to hear, but it was truly the reality. So in Lebanon, I somehow was able to find several survivors that I was able to speak with. One of them, I'll tell you his story because I thought it was particularly poignant, because there's beauty to it and there's real sadness to it. His family had, in Ghouta, that was a main supplier of dairy to the rest of Damascus. And so while they were under siege, they couldn't get any rice, bread, anything like that in, but they had all this milk. And so they were dumping milk. So his father was actually quite resourceful and opened up a little ice cream shop in the middle of a siege. And people would come in, and he was able to fund like his own little generator for his ice cream shop because there was obviously no electricity. And slowly sold enough ice creams that he lit up his own apartment building, and so soon lit up the entire block with a generator. There was like the one block of electricity in the whole area because of ice cream. I just thought that was such a sweet story, no pun intended. But his son, the boy I'm telling you about, his name is Abdurrahman. He was like a lot of the survivors I had met, like 3 of the survivors I had met. They were young boys, and they would run around to different houses trying to, pick up, literally bodies. They didn't know if people were dead or alive, and just transport them to the hospitals. And most of them then got gassed themselves. And that's what happened to Abdurrahman. His sister's friend from school, they're both like maybe 9 years old, was on the roof of a building screaming, "Help me, help me, my parents were killed, help me, help me." And he went to help her, and then there was a lady laying in the lobby of the building, so he picked her up and put her in the car, and he started going blind, and he started throwing up, and so he rushed home and kept sort of throwing up blood. And he was blinded for 2 weeks, and he didn't know if the girl survived until he saw her on TV in what became, I think, the iconic video of that attack. It's a little girl in a hospital, sort of waking up and just frantically touching her face and saying, "I'm alive, I'm alive, I'm alive, I'm alive," obviously in Arabic. And both her parents died, but at least she was alive, and he was relieved that she was alive. His story, for example, never made it into our story. And so that's the other thing that comes with journalism. Sometimes you hear really powerful things that just, wind up cut out of a story. Some things, for example, covering that story that didn't make it into our story was, I didn't understand why such a large number of women and children were killed in that attack versus men. And it turns out that, if there's a war and you take shelter, you generally run down to the lower floors of a building, to a basement, and it would happen at night, so women and children were all sleeping. But when a chemical weapon hits, apparently the gas spreads sort of horizontally. So it got everybody on the lower floors. And children's bodies are so little that it spreads through them quicker. And then when the makeshift hospitals started getting overwhelmed, usually what you have to do is you have to hose people down and strip them. And, they would usually do that in a separate room for women, because of their tradition and because, they would consider it shameful. But they didn't have time. So in some of the places, they didn't know what was happening. So that's actually the main reason such a large number of women and children were killed. And so, that doesn't make it into a story. Is it a story worth telling? Is it news? It doesn't matter if we tell it or not, because, those are the kinds of questions that I think we all have to answer for ourselves. I think most journalists, including me, would say, yes, it's definitely worth telling. It's definitely worth bearing witness. But in illustrating this, I hope I'm pointing out the major, clear, glaring obstacle is that we're not there. We can't see it, feel it, breathe it, confirm it. That's just, a reality, and it makes you like one step removed in some ways, but it also means like you're living in two worlds. So, for example, I once had a friend who was visiting Beirut from Dubai. He has an art gallery in Dubai and comes from a very different realm than my sort of journalist crazy life. And I was at dinner with him and another friend, and I get a phone call that a Scud missile hit Aleppo. Aleppo is Syria's largest city. It's larger than Damascus. To think a Scud missile hit a city, it's shocking. But here I am in trendy Beirut, which I know from here they seem very close, but they are geographically really close, but they're really different places. And it's sitting in a restaurant, writing down notes, trying to confirm the story and not being sure whether or not that's going to be in the paper. I don't know what point I'm trying to make except to say it's a very different than being there, living, breathing it, and then in living these two realities. It's such a dichotomous reality, and so I really feel that although I'm here and so far away, I can really relate to what is happening in parallel all the time because I lived it. I lived that kind of a pace for 2 years. Another example of a relationship, when you build a relationship, I feel, over Skype or phone, I think you have to invest more time in it. But then because if I were to meet you, I could get a sense of your personality by the way you look, by a gesture. You can't do the same over a phone call. And over the course of the conflict, people change. And one activist I had talked to, he had given his name to me as Wissam Majid, and he had started, or was one of the founders of a news network in Aleppo, so that would give you sort of breaking news. Now there's tons of these networks. It would be Scud hit here, plane hit there, bomb went off here, and you'd sort of get them on Skype, or some of them have Facebook pages. And he eventually, one day, changed his picture, and there was a picture of him with a pistol on his desk. And I said, I thought you're a nonviolent activist, what happened? And he said, it's just gotten too dangerous. And then on a side story, he had a really cute story, I thought. When the rebels first took over Aleppo, his fiancée lived on the governed side, and he was on the rebel-controlled side. And at that point, the rebels were strong and were able to subsidize the price of bread and wheat. And so bread was 5 times more expensive where she lived. And although her father completely disapproved of him, he would meet him every day at a checkpoint, and this boy, Wissam, would give him bread to take home. Their love story didn't survive the conflict, but I actually got to meet this guy in person twice. He came to Beirut because some nonprofits fund workshops to train these kinds of activists. So I got to meet. I actually also separately have a small cafe in Beirut. He would come every day after his workshops, and then he told me his real name. It was Ahmad, and he was sort of no longer scared. Like, this is my identity. This is who I am. And then, over time, you sort of lose touch. You're not in touch as often. And one night his last messages to me were very desperate, saying, I'm completely disillusioned. The revolution is gone. They would call it political money, and basically a lot of the activists felt like money from the Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, was playing a stronger role, not just in terms of arms, but in terms of perspectives and policies. So he said, political money has ruined everything, and help me, get me out of here. He literally said, take me to hell. I'm sure it's better than Aleppo today. And I, couldn't. As much as I would have wanted to. But and then one day he chatted me and I had missed it, I had gone to bed, and then the next morning I saw on Facebook that he had been killed in a barrel bomb in December of 2013. And this is where news kind of gets fickle. I had written about barrel bombs twice that month because over 500 people had been killed that month in Aleppo alone from barrel bombs. And when something personal like this happens, and another personal thing had actually happened that week, it's not something I felt like I ever want to write or report about. It's too kind of close. And I called my boss and I said, well, I actually know someone who was killed in a barrel bomb, and we could maybe I'm sure I could get the details of what happened and who was with him. Could be more of an effective story. And he said, Rima, barrel bombs are like suicide bombs in in Baghdad. They're not news anymore. And he's right. The journalist in me knows is right. They're not news because they're not new. But is it not news? I mean, they're still used today, and they're exactly what they sound like. They're a metallic barrel stuffed with shrapnel, used car parts, and dynamite that is dumped from a plane or a helicopter just randomly over areas. Is that not news? I was also kind of relieved not to have to report on it. So much of this talk is, these aren't the most dramatic stories. They pale in comparison to so many other stories I could have told you about. But they are what journalists face every day in covering the conflict. And how do you not internalize it? And how do you confirm it when you're not there? Those are two things I really grappled with. One time, so Hezbollah in Lebanon obviously is playing a major role in the war in Syria, and they didn't confirm their role until May of 2013, in a very decisive battle of a town called Qusair. Qusair is close to the Lebanese border, and it connects Damascus to the port cities. It's like there's a highway. The port cities are predominantly Alawite and sympathetic to the regime. And so Damascus, obviously, those are the areas Damascus is by far most focused on and controls firmly. If they were to lose Qusair, they would have been cut off. So their supplies that were to come from the ports would not make it to the city. Qusair is also not far from the Lebanese border. And it was really shocking because now that, Hezbollah went in and won that battle and changed the course of the war. And Hezbollah is playing a very decisive role there. So I was writing a story about, there's a town called Arsel, which is it's a Lebanese town on the Syrian border, which is predominantly Sunni. And it's surrounded by Shiite villages, and Hezbollah is Shiite. And so thus considered unfriendly, obviously, to the opposition in Syria. So Arsel, before the war, was home to maybe 30,000 people and is now home to over 120,000 people. It's by far the largest town with the largest influx of Syrian refugees, and it has the only Lebanese government-sanctioned refugee camp because of the vast numbers. But the people there were really scared to go away. But it was just very striking to me. They're like barely 10 miles from each other, Arsel and Baalbek, which is like a Hezbollah heartland. And I did this story about these conflicting narratives, how each side is demonizing the other side, and these people are terrified from these people, and like all kinds of rumors that swirl. And so as I get to the town one day, I had already been up there. As I get to the town, though, it was very different. It was packed, but it was like eerily quiet. People had been, the Qusayr had fallen, but the civilians had gone, but no one knew where they were for days. And here they were showing up in Arsel, where I was, and just truckloads and walking. People were literally sunburned, elderly kids, because they had slept in orchards overnight for days. The only people that were sort of frantic were people who would recognize someone, be like, oh my God, have you seen my brother? Or have you seen my neighbor? Or have you, they'd recognize someone. I saw one family unite, like an uncle and his nephews, and the nephew just completely broke down crying because his brother had been killed on the way, because as they were leaving, they were continually shelled. And they were shelled on the way. I've never seen anything like that. I mean, obviously, although I was there, I'm still once removed because I didn't see the actual bombings and the actual shellings, and I didn't march on that journey with them. But it was really just, I've never seen such a mass shell-shocked and just traumatized people. I mean, people were distributing mattresses and doing NGO work, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. I mean, that's usually very frenzied, and people were just, they didn't even care. They just wanted to sit. So, in talking about this, I mean, I guess the 3 points I would make are, there are a lot of obstacles. Security and reporting from afar presents a whole range of obstacles. But then sometimes, in some cases, you're able to build better relationships, I think. It's difficult to confirm truth. The other thing with talking to people who are going through so much is they want you to help them. And, it's not your job. You can't, technically, if you're writing about them. And B, you feel bad because then they feel like you're taking advantage of them. Like, why am I going to waste my time and tell you my story? Some become almost needy because it's like therapeutic to talk about what happened, and they want you to help them, and they want to just get it off their chests. But they want to keep that going, and you want to give, so you want to keep hearing. But I mean, there's really very little to do. But that's also another dilemma. I mean, how do you create that boundary, and how can you really help them? So, in order to help them, I tried to do nonprofit work, which is something I've always done on the side. I've told you a little bit about Zakira. I just realized that the books are here, so you can see them afterwards. Sorry, so I've done two different sets of things. I've, on my own, conducted 2 food drives, just sort of emailing friends, relatives here in the States, saying, look, I mean, there's this community that haven't eaten in this amount of time, and I've been able to raise, I mean, on my little scale, like $25,000, but I was able to feed like 100 families for a month. A smaller drive a little later, and then this year I was able, with a group of Syrian women who grew up in Saudi Arabia, who had like an amazing network. They raised in like a week $50,000, which paled in comparison to me, but it was amazing because we did that in January of this year, and we're able to give families, firewood, winter coats, boots. I was telling people earlier that, going to these Syrian camps, in Lebanon. We have Palestinian refugee camps that have been there since 1948 and 1967, since the establishment of the State of Israel in the 1967 war. Lebanon is a place that's multi-sectarian, and the government is based on this breakdown of Christians and Muslims. The parliament is 50% Christian, 50% Muslim. The president of Lebanon is a Maronite Christian, always, must be. Although we currently don't have a president, the prime minister is a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament is a Shiite Muslim. So to bring in an influx of a large population of another sect creates a whole different array of issues that I don't think would usually be discussed in other places, but because of this sectarian infrastructure that they have to the state. So creating a camp is a very loaded concept in Lebanon because we have these camps that have never left. Palestinians in Lebanon don't have citizenship. They often don't have the right to work. The vast majority do not. And they're still there. So with the Syrian crisis, I mean, obviously this was a huge mistake because now you have 1.2 million people. The good thing about a camp is that they're all in one place. If they need schools, you go here. If you need hospitals, you go here. Right now, there's hundreds of areas with random tents all over the country. So that's created a whole other array of issues that, a lot of organizations are trying to face. In any humanitarian emergency, but I think especially in this one, there's always a time where you shift from relief to sort of resettlement. And in this case, relief, when you say the word emergency or crisis, there's a temporal aspect to that. There's a time aspect to that. And in this case, it's been going on for 4 years, but people still need shoes and firewood and basics. So then when do you stop focusing on that and focusing on schools, education, jobs, houses, not tents? People are still coming in, there aren't the resources, and what do you do? And I sadly don't have the answer to that. But I think one thing that, I've talked about this today, one thing that really strikes me about this community is that their parents are all literate and they're all educated, and these kids have not been in school for 3, some of them 4 years now. They obviously can't read. If you're a parent and you've just, survived the unimaginable and you're living in a tent and it's freezing in the winter and your tent caves in when it snows and you're stifling hot in the summer and your kids are around you 24/7, you're not patient. And so there's a whole other dynamic that's developed. Because of the way the camps have sort of come up in this makeshift pattern, a lot of them have a kind of mayor known as a shewish. And they are, in those cases, they would be camps in agricultural areas where they would have seasonal labor come in, mostly from Syria during peaceful times, and leave. But this shewish guy would usually just be in Lebanon forever, living in this tent, or have a house nearby, but have a tent near this plot of land that he takes care of. And a lot of the nonprofits have to work through this guy, who is not an elected official, not necessarily an honest guy. There are all kinds of internal power struggles that you can't always navigate. Also, there are changing government policies that nonprofit organizations need to adapt to. This year, which I thought was a great thing, finally, Lebanese public schools are allowing Syrian children to come in, all of them. They have added a shift, an afternoon shift after school. They finally got the funding for it. However, the Lebanese school system is very different than the Syrian school system. There's a big focus on languages. People in Lebanon are often trilingual, speak English, Arabic, and French, and that's integrated into their curriculum in the elementary years. In Syria, they learn English, but sort of at later stages. So just sending these kids to school alone will probably set them up for failure. And a lot of the NGOs that were servicing them would create informal schools. And now some of them are continuing with their informal schools. Some of the families are kind of scared to send their kids to a school because, Lebanese are different than we are, or it's really far. What if my kids get stopped at a checkpoint? Is there a checkpoint on the way? I've seen an NGO where I really felt that they were kind of perpetuating that fear in order to stay in business. In a sense, it's a business. Other NGOs are actually moving fast. They are creating like tutoring programs in order to help kids kind of catch up. I met one NGO recently that is doing that is putting the Lebanese national curriculum all online with like lesson plans. They probably can't sit for a test and get an actual degree, but I think that's a really important step. And if these kids eventually get tablets or internet access, maybe they can educate themselves at home. So basically, I'd like to end by saying that, I'm happy to answer any geopolitical questions you wanted, but I thought giving this kind of a personal account might give you a different perspective than something you could just sort of Google online. I really truly believe that we, as a global community, have a responsibility toward these people. It's a vast number of people that we're seeing in this way. And I mean, I even make the argument, like a strategic argument is, children in Syria in areas governed by the likes of ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra go to school. So if Syria would remain a contiguous country like we know it today, in 20 years, those kids are going to be the literati and the kids sitting in camps in Lebanon. I mean, it's an opportunity to teach, and it's an opportunity to have an impact on the future of Syria. I also think that countries I don't think Lebanon always means well, but even if they meant well, always in this case, they haven't had the resources to do what they need to. So to advocate to help those countries to curb this flight that we're seeing to the West. And also, just on the level of the atrocities that we're seeing, I mean, there are rules of war. If we have to fight a war, we have to remember that there are rules. And I just wish that discussion was still prevalent. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you much for that. We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, sir.
Is there any organization that you think is doing a particularly good job in aiding the Syrian refugees?
Yes, I think there are many organizations that are, both international and local. One organization I actually think is a great organization is called the Syrian American Medical Society, SAMS. It's based out of Ohio. They send doctors, doctors to refugee camps to help with medical care. They send doctors into Syria. I was in southern Turkey once, and they had an expert American doctor who had, I forget what it was, but he created like a prosthesis that they used during the Vietnam War to train Syrian doctors in Syria to use the same method, because they don't have like the typical emergency room like we would know. I think UNICEF does good work, Doctors Without Borders, International Rescue Committee. There are a lot of local NGOs that do great work. There is an organization I like a lot called Jusur, which means bridges in Arabic, and it's founded by a bunch of Syrian Americans who focus on education. So they focus on trying to get kids scholarships. I know they have a school. There are many organizations, both local and international, that do good work, but they're, for the most part, under-resourced. And like I said, this system of, the larger organizations often donate to smaller organizations on the ground, and there's a cycle to it that's hard to break. That you want to keep doing what you're doing because you think you're doing good, but also you kind of want to stay in a job, and maybe the needs have shifted. So there's a cycle to it that I think can be improved in a lot of cases, but for the most part, there are really amazing people doing amazing work.
How did you get to Syria?
I'm sorry, how did I get there? Mm-hmm. I didn't go.
Oh, you didn't go?
I was based in Lebanon, and I was a local hire with the Journal, so they didn't send me. And toward the end, the last person to go to the rebel-controlled areas of Syria from the Wall Street Journal was in June of 2013. One of my colleagues was, for 2 years, the only foreign correspondent in Damascus and allowed to be in Damascus. He's since been kicked out of Damascus, but we kind of did it that way. But it got too dangerous. I mean, I wouldn't have gone in because I was, like I said, a local hire, but it got too dangerous because of the kidnappings and the beheadings that we've sadly seen on TV.
Good. There are so many groups fighting with each other there, right? Alawites and Sunnis and Shiites and then ISIS. And I mean, most of us don't even understand who is who and who to support and who is good guy and who is the bad guy.
Well, as a journalist, I'm not supposed to tell you who's a good guy, who's a bad guy, right. But I can paint a picture. The Assad family has ruled Syria for many generations. There was Bashar right now and his father Hafiz, and they come from the Alawite sect, which they say is described as an offshoot of Shiite Islam. But more importantly, they're strategically aligned. I mean, I don't think this is a religious war. It's not like people are like, my Quran says this. I mean, they read the same book, but it's not an ideological war. It's, I mean, there's an ethnic aspect to it, but it's a hatred, not like an argument. He's allied with what they call the axis of resistance, which is Iran and Hezbollah, and now we see Russia and Russian warplanes there. There are lots of groups. I mean, when the Syrian uprising started, it was truly that. It was an uprising. It was college kids who would, take to the streets, and I think very bravely, that's me giving my opinion, taking a stand. But when it became a war, and that transformed. There are lots and lots of groups. I mean, there was a Free Syrian Army. It still exists in a very, very weak, kind of scattered way. But I mean, I would consider them sort of friendly to the U.S. And not ideologically opposed to groups, to anything that we would have an issue supporting. I mean, there's Jabhat al-Nusra, there's ISIS. ISIS is not majority Syrian. There's a majority of Iraqis and foreign fighters that are part of ISIS. There are Syrians that are part of it, but that was not a homegrown group. The homegrown sort of Al-Qaeda type group is called Jabhat al-Nusra. There's another Salafist group called Ahrar al-Sham, which is a predominantly Syrian group. When ISIS took over Raqqa, the government warplanes didn't hit Raqqa for months. The government sees, I would argue, the government probably sees ISIS as a boon to their narrative because, I mean, if you want Bashar al-Assad or ISIS, I mean, a guy who's clean-shaven in a suit is probably a better deal, but that's what he wants you to believe, those are the two narratives. And, from the reporting I've seen, Russian warplanes haven't been hitting ISIS, they've been hitting the rebels. So, I mean, who are good guys, who are bad guys? I mean, I guess everybody's left to judge. Bashar al-Assad does say and does put out the narrative that I am the protector of the minorities. So, and these are that the Sunni majority is gonna come get us. I mean, so most, if you're gonna look at it sort of sectarianly, which, I mean, I guess we have to, but, is unfortunate. I would say probably the majority of the minorities would still side with him, but that's not by and large true. I mean, I know many Christians, Druze, Ismailis that oppose him, and those would be considered minorities.
Right behind you, Bob.
Hi, my name is Dimas Solomon. I'm from Alexandria, Egypt. First, I would like to شكرا أولاً إن أنت جيتي مرحبا أهلا. I wanted to ask about something I read in an article like a few months ago, and I'm not sure if you would have the answer, or experienced this before. But some of the people like get brainwashed and try to make a contact with people in ISIS because they are curious about the situation there. And one of the girls, she got brainwashed. I don't know which state, I can't remember. And when I was in Egypt like a few months ago, a lot of people joined ISIS and all of that because They just want to get in contact. So my question is, how do they do that? Like, how people from there brainwash people from the outside world, and how to prevent it, or what recommendation you would give?
That's a tough question. I can't say that I'm an expert, but there was actually a great New York Times article a few months ago about that. I don't know if you happen to read it. I think that article plays into an emotional aspect involved. They tend to prey on lonely people. And I think anytime you want to brainwash anyone, this is just from life. You try to isolate them from the people around them, and you try to say, this is our secret, keep this between us, keep this between us. You try to portray yourself as honorable, and more honorable than everybody around you. And keeping a secret, if you and I were to discuss an issue, I might go home to talk to whomever, my friends, my family, about it. But if you tell me this is a secret, then I don't have another set of eyes to necessarily help me discern a situation. So I think isolating their prey is key. I think bombarding them. That article was saying how it talked about they portrayed a pretty lonely girl. I forget I think she was in Washington or Oregon. And she, suddenly had all these Facebook friends and all these Twitter friends. These things matter to some people. And they can portray themselves as honorable. And, a narrative is a very important thing. There are these facts, and you can look at it from any direction. But if you convincingly put them in this order, then you say, this is the way. We are oppressed because X, Y, Z, and this is the way, this is the right thing. But I think, in my opinion, isolating, and then so you create sort of a feeling of loneliness, but then giving them a community is what has been their strength.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming. I know you're not a prophet, but just with your knowledge and all of that, now that the United States is getting a little bit more involved, just look ahead, and how do you see this ultimately, coming out, ending, winding up? Is it going to be more bloodbath, or what? Any insight you might have?
It's a hard one. I was actually reading an article today about all the U.S. missed opportunities. I would have had much more advice like a year ago or 2 years ago. I tend to be motivated by the humanitarian aspect. So I think a no-fly zone 2 years ago would have been a game changer. It would have protected civilians. It would have kept them within their borders. It would have, if you had downed their air force, the rebels could have won on their own. That was what the regime had on them. Right now, it's really messy. I think, if I had to be a decision maker, and in a sense, I'm glad I'm not, I think I would try to empower. There are friendly elements that we have sometimes weakened unintentionally. And sometimes because of mistrust or just finding them incompetent, haven't helped enough. To get rid of the regime today, the regime was probably, by all accounts, not my personal accounts, but accounts of analysts I've spoken to, was on its last legs, and actually a Hezbollah fighter I've spoken to, until the Russians intervened. It was a matter of weeks. The army was on its last legs. But to create a vacuum and not have a strong replacement or a strong alternative, we've seen has been an issue. And right now, like I said, they're out there, but I think I would hone them and then really focus on getting rid of the regime. And also we've clearly seen this is not a war that can be won militarily. No side is winning. They say the government governs 30 to 40% of the country. The rest is governed by ragtag groups. So, a political solution, I think, will probably be the only way, but I would say that you need a partner there. You can't sit at a table and not have a Syrian there. Who's your guy? You have to have a guy,
Rima, thank you so much for visiting us.
You.
Jerry, thank you for connecting us, and thank all of you for coming out this evening.
Thank you.